December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burned beneath the Pacific sun, and a nation once distant from war was hurled violently into the flames. The roar of Japanese Zeros, the smoke curling from the shattered battleships, the frantic cries of sailors trapped below deck. This was the beginning of a conflict that would span continents and seas, consuming millions of lives. In Tokyo, the High Command celebrated, believing they had struck a crippling blow. But for the Japanese people, ordinary civilians on the home islands, the war was about to open a chapter they could scarcely imagine. For years, propaganda filled their ears with warnings. Americans were beasts, monsters without mercy, invaders who would burn their land and slaughter their families. Mothers whispered to children that if the Americans came, it would be better to die by their own hand than fall into the hands of such devils. Yet when the war tide shifted and American boots finally pressed upon Japanese soil, what the civilians encountered defied every nightmare they had been taught. Summer 1944. Saipan, an island fortress in the Marianas, became a battlefield drenched in fire and fear. The Japanese army had sworn to resist to the last man. Civilians, huddled in caves, clutched kitchen knives, bamboo spears, and even their infants, prepared to leap from cliffs rather than face capture. From the ridges, families watched the approach of olive-drab figures moving cautiously among the ruins. American soldiers, rifles at the ready, advanced through smoke and rubble. The sound of flamethrowers and machine guns echoed across the valleys. And yet, as the lines pushed deeper, something extraordinary began to unfold. Where civilians expected violence, some instead found hands outstretched not with weapons, but with food. A battered steel pot hissed with boiling water. A GI stirred instant coffee over a camp stove. Another pulled open a battered box, revealing donuts, shipped across oceans to remind the troops of home. For the Japanese civilians, gaunt with hunger and parched from weeks in hiding, the sight was surreal. Children peeked out from the shadows, their faces caked with soot. An American private, not much older than some of the boys he now faced, crouched low and set down a tin cup. He didn't speak their language, but the gesture was universal. Steam curled into the air as the bitter, dark brew reached trembling lips. A young mother, clutching her child, watched in disbelief as a soldier tore a donut in half and placed it gently in the boy's tiny hand. Here was the enemy she had been told would kill them without hesitation. And yet, instead of a rifle's crack, there was warmth. Instead of brutality, there was compassion, but this moment of humanity existed against a backdrop of unimaginable horror. On Saipan alone, thousands of civilians chose suicide over surrender, hurling themselves from the cliffs of Marpi Point as American troops looked on in helpless shock. The contrast was stark. Some saw the Americans as demons, others began to glimpse something different. On Okinawa the following year, the divide grew sharper still. Leaflets fluttered from the skies, promising safety to those who laid down their arms. Yet Japanese soldiers forced civilians to stay behind, warning them that Americans would mutilate and enslave them. Whole families hid in caves, listening to the thunder of naval bombardment overhead, their bodies trembling with each blast. Then came the moment of contact. Exhausted Marines, faces streaked with grime, crawled into those same caves where families huddled. Instead of gunfire, they produced food, rations, chocolate bars, and tins of condensed milk. Coffee brewed in battered canteens was offered to men who had not tasted warmth in months. Donuts, hardened from their long journey, were softened in steaming cups before being shared among strangers. The children, their stomachs shrunken and their eyes wide with disbelief, reached out slowly. The bitter drink and sweet bread, so ordinary for the Americans, became a revelation for those who had lived on scraps of roots and seawater. It was not just food. It was proof that everything they had been told about the enemy was unraveling. For the soldiers themselves, the act carried its own weight. These were young men far from home, carrying in their packs the simplest reminders of the world they had left behind. Donuts and coffee were not merely sustenance. They were tokens of America, of diners and Sunday mornings, of mothers and sweethearts waiting an ocean away. To share them was to bridge an abyss. Amid the rubble of war, they offered a sliver of their humanity to the very people who had once cheered their destruction. Imagine the silence in those moments, the crash of artillery fading, the smoke thinning, and the smell of cordite lingering in the air. An American GI, barely 20, handed a tin cup to an old man whose hands shook too violently to hold it steady. He guided the cup to his lips. The old man's eyes, once filled with terror, welled with tears. For a heartbeat, they were no longer enemies. They were simply men who had endured too much, but the disbelief lingered. Many civilians refused to trust, clutching tightly to the myths of propaganda. Rumors spread in hushed voices. Perhaps the food was poisoned, perhaps the kindness a trap. Yet hunger overpowered suspicion, and soon whole families dared to approach. Soldiers began to set up makeshift kitchens, handing out donuts fried in portable vats and brewing endless pots of coffee. The aroma drifted through shattered streets, carried on the island winds. For the first time in years, some civilians felt warmth fill their bellies. This simple ritual, donuts and coffee, became a quiet symbol of something larger. It was the collision of two worlds, one taught to hate without question, the other learning that victory carried with it the burden of mercy. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable that conquerors would share their rations with the conquered. Yet to many Americans, raised in a culture of abundance, the act was instinctive. They could not imagine letting children starve when they had food to spare. And so, on the battle-scarred beaches of Saipan, in the bombed-out villages of Okinawa, and on the very soil of Japan itself after surrender, countless small encounters took place. Encounters too ordinary to appear in strategy books and too fragile to be recorded in official reports. Yet they lived on in memory. Civilians who had expected death instead tasted coffee. Children who had been warned of monsters instead licked sugar from their fingers. In those moments, war's brutal machinery faltered, and humanity broke through. It was not peace. Not yet. The bombs still fell, the battles still raged, and the world still trembled on the edge of destruction. But for those who tasted it, the warmth of a donut and the steam of a cup of coffee were proof that even in the darkest of wars, mercy could flicker where no one expected it. By 1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal crescendo. What had begun as a lightning sweep of Japanese victories across Asia and the Pacific was now unraveling, island by island, under the relentless pressure of American forces. The Japanese Empire had once stretched from Manchuria to the jungles of Burma, from the Aleutians in the north to the coral atolls of the south. But the tide had turned. The Americans, wielding overwhelming industrial might, had carved their way across the Central Pacific in a series of amphibious invasions that left Japanese strongholds smoldering behind them. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, each name etched into the annals of suffering. Each battle a step closer to the Japanese homeland. For civilians within Japan and in its occupied territories, the transformation was dizzying. In the early years, propaganda posters had painted Americans as cowardly and decadent, incapable of enduring real hardship. The Japanese military, hardened by campaigns in China and indoctrinated with the spirit of Bushido, believed their ferocity and sacrifice would compensate for any technological disadvantage. But on the battlefield, those illusions shattered. American forces brought not only tanks, planes, and ships in staggering numbers, but also a doctrine that emphasized overwhelming firepower and relentless supply. Their strategy was not subtle. It was grinding, methodical, and fueled by an industrial machine that seemed limitless. And yet, for the civilians, another war was being waged, one of perception, psychology, and survival. In Tokyo, radios blared the same warnings over and over. Americans would slaughter anyone who fell into their hands. Newspapers printed fantastical stories of mutilation, enslavement, and dishonor. Children in schools were taught to wield bamboo spears to prepare themselves for the day when they would defend their villages to the death. Mothers practiced suicide drills with their families, rehearsing how to use grenades or household blades to kill themselves and their children rather than submit. This was not hysteria in a vacuum. The Japanese government knew its people would soon face invasion, and fear was its weapon. But in the Pacific Islands where civilians lived under Japanese rule, the reality was more complicated. The soldiers stationed there treated civilians with a mixture of paternalism and brutality. Food was requisitioned for the military, leaving families to scrape by on roots and seaweed. Labor was demanded for fortifications. In Okinawa, Farmers were forced to dig miles of trenches, even as their own fields went untended. When the Americans advanced, Japanese commanders often conscripted civilians as human shields or ordered them into suicide charges with sharpened sticks. Against this backdrop of suffering, the notion of an enemy who might share food was not just unlikely, it was inconceivable. Yet the Americans were not fighting solely with bullets and bombs. From the beginning, psychological warfare played a role. Aircraft dropped leaflets promising safety to civilians who surrendered. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in halting Japanese, urging families to lay down their arms and come forward. Still, the chasm of distrust ran deep. The stories drilled into civilian minds were not easily undone. When American soldiers landed on Saipan in June 1944, they faced not just entrenched Japanese troops, but also a population that had been trained to see them as devils. The cliffs of Marpi Point and the beaches below became mass graves as hundreds, then thousands, leapt to their deaths rather than face capture. American Marines, horrified, tried to shout assurances. Some held up food, cans of Spam, tins of milk, packets of cigarettes, hoping the sight of sustenance might break through the terror in the broader context of the war. These moments of attempted compassion were insignificant compared to the colossal machinery of destruction. By 1944, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate of nearly 100,000 per year. Its shipyards turned out Liberty ships in less than 2 weeks. The Japanese, strangled by blockade and bombing, could not compete. Yet the very scale of American production allowed its soldiers to carry with them luxuries that seemed fantastical in a world of scarcity. Instant coffee, powdered milk, chocolate, and even donuts prepared in field kitchens. These were symbols of abundance. For Americans, they were reminders of home, of diners and kitchens far away. For Japanese civilians, they were proof of a world they had been told did not exist. The context of this cultural clash was staggering. Japan's cities were already under the shadow of destruction. By late 1944, B-29 bombers from bases in the Marianas would rain firestorms upon Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Civilians endured nightly raids, huddling in makeshift shelters as their neighborhoods vanished in oceans of flame. Hunger gnawed at the population, worsened by a naval blockade that cut off food imports. In this desperate atmosphere, propaganda doubled down. Families were told that starvation was preferable to surrender, that to be captured was to lose one's honor forever. The Americans, in contrast, were increasingly aware of the need to manage civilian populations as they advanced. The war was not only about defeating armies, it was about breaking the will of a nation without annihilating its people entirely. And so, in the foxholes and rubble-strewn streets, something unexpected took root. American soldiers, often out of instinct rather than strategy, began to share their rations. A donut dunked in coffee, a candy bar slipped into a child's hand, a cigarette offered to a trembling farmer. Small gestures carried immense symbolic weight. They cut across the walls of fear and myth that propaganda had built. In some cases, they saved lives, coaxing civilians out of hiding when starvation threatened to kill them. In others, they created memories that endured long after the last shot was fired. This was not uniform, nor was it universal. Atrocities still occurred, as they do in every war. Distrust lingered, sharpened by years of indoctrination. But within the larger arc of the Pacific War, these human encounters revealed the profound gap between what civilians had been told and what they sometimes experienced. To understand their disbelief, the astonishment that Americans could offer donuts and coffee, we must place ourselves in the world they inhabited, where every day was defined by hunger, fear, and the certainty of impending death. Against that darkness, even the simplest act of kindness became a blinding light. By the time American forces reached Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the scale of civilian suffering had reached an unimaginable level. Nearly 1/3 of the island's population would die in the battle. And yet amid the carnage, the same quiet acts repeated themselves. Coffee poured into dented cups, donuts fried in makeshift vats, and candy bars broken in half and passed to trembling children. The broader war context was merciless, but within it flickered moments of humanity that defied all expectations. It was in the quiet moments between battles, When the thunder of artillery faded and the acrid haze of cordite thinned in the air, that the true mystery began to take shape. Japanese civilians, their minds saturated by years of warnings, waited for the nightmare they had been promised. Mothers braced for the sound of boots storming through their homes, for the brutality described in propaganda leaflets and whispered by teachers in classrooms. Fathers, emaciated and weary, prepared themselves for humiliation and torment. Children, wide-eyed and skeletal, clutched at their mothers' sleeves, waiting for the monsters to appear. And then, when the soldiers came, they brought not cruelty, but sustenance. Donuts fried in field kitchens, still warm and dusted with sugar. Coffee brewed in battered tin cups, its steam rising into the humid island air. Cigarettes, chocolate, even chewing gum. Instead of the horrors civilians were conditioned to expect, there was bewildering kindness. This was the hidden advantage, an advantage not of weaponry or tactics, but of perception, of humanity. The Japanese military had depended on fear as a weapon, believing it would stiffen civilian resistance, make surrender unthinkable, and transform every village into a fortress. But American soldiers, hardened by their own campaigns, carried with them something unexpected, an instinctive generosity rooted in abundance. In a war defined by destruction, the simple act of sharing food became a weapon of a different sort. For civilians who had lived on scraps and lies, a donut and a cup of coffee carried a message more powerful than any broadcast. It told them that the enemy was not the monster they had been led to believe. The disbelief was visceral. In Okinawa, elderly men emerged from caves with trembling hands, expecting execution, only to be offered rations instead. Children hid behind mothers' kimonos, peering out as Marines crouched low, holding out donuts softened in coffee to make them easier to chew. A boy, no older than 7, bit cautiously, expecting poison, then widened his eyes as sweetness flooded his mouth. He looked up at the foreign soldier and saw not a demon, but a young man smiling, dirt-streaked, weary, yet unmistakably human. These moments were repeated again and again, each one a fracture in the wall of propaganda that had isolated the Japanese people from reality. Why did this shock run so deep? Because every aspect of wartime life had told civilians to expect the opposite. Japanese broadcasts painted Americans as sadistic invaders who would defile women, enslave men, and slaughter children without hesitation. Stories spread of villages burned, of unspeakable tortures. Civilians on Saipan, convinced of these horrors, hurled themselves off cliffs rather than face capture. Mothers drowned infants in the surf, believing it an act of mercy. The Japanese High Command had built its strategy on this expectation, that fear would bind its people to the war effort until the very end. But the hidden advantage of the Americans lay not only in their overwhelming firepower, but also in the collision between myth and reality. Each time a GI extended food to a starving civilian, each time a child laughed at the taste of a foreign sweet, the machinery of fear faltered. There was also the psychological edge among the soldiers themselves. For Americans, to share was natural. Their culture, born in a land of relative abundance, taught them that food was meant to be plentiful, that even in hardship there was enough to give. The donuts and coffee they offered were not strategic weapons in the traditional sense, but symbols of the very society they represented, a society that could produce not just bombs and rifles, but comfort and warmth. To the Japanese civilians, raised in a culture where scarcity had become normal, this generosity was baffling. How could an enemy fighting so ruthlessly in battle also choose to extend kindness afterward? The hidden advantage was therefore twofold. It softened resistance among civilians, and it revealed to Japanese soldiers the fragility of their own propaganda. When civilians began to approach American lines not with weapons, but with open hands, the myth unraveled. Japanese troops, who had sworn to fight to the last, watched as families they had expected to join them in death instead reached out for donuts and coffee. To fight for an empire was one thing. To fight when even your own people began to doubt the stories, that was another. Reports from the field reflected this confusion. American intelligence officers noted the disbelief in civilian eyes, the way suspicion slowly dissolved into acceptance with every shared meal. Marines recounted how families first approached cautiously, convinced they were walking into a trap, only to return the next day with neighbors, eager to taste again what they had been denied for so long. In Okinawa, a Marine officer wrote in his diary, "They came out of the caves like ghosts, hollow-eyed, expecting the worst. We gave them donuts and coffee. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on their faces, like the world had just turned upside down." The Japanese government had not prepared for this kind of warfare. They understood tanks and artillery, kamikazes and suicide charges. They did not understand the power of perception, the weapon of kindness. Civilians began to question. If Americans were truly monsters, why did they feed the hungry? If surrender meant dishonor, why did it feel so much like relief? In the silence of occupied villages, over the clink of tin cups and the scent of coffee, an empire's grip on its people weakened. The shock was greatest among the elderly, who had endured decades of hardship and sacrifice. For them, to taste sugar again after years of rationing was like stepping into another world. Tears rolled down faces lined by hunger as they sipped coffee, its bitterness softened with milk and sugar packets. Young children, too young to understand the war but old enough to remember hunger, laughed for the first time in months as they chewed donuts. These scenes did not win battles directly, but they won something far more subtle: trust. And trust was the one thing the Japanese high command could not afford to lose. Thus, the hidden advantage was revealed, not in steel, nor in firepower, but in humanity. Where the empire had sought to make surrender unthinkable, Americans made it survivable. Where fear was meant to bind civilians to the war machine, compassion loosened its hold. The disbelief of Japanese civilians that the enemy could bring not death, but donuts and coffee, was the crack in the armor of propaganda. And through that crack, the light of truth began to seep in. Understand the power of these small gestures: donuts, fried in portable kitchens, coffee poured from battered tins. We must look deeper into the mechanics of how such comforts even reached the far-flung battlefields of the Pacific. Behind every steaming cup was an intricate network of engineering, logistics, and industrial willpower that defined the American war machine. The United States fought World War II not only with rifles and tanks, but also with factories that could mass-produce both weapons and warmth. And in that capacity for abundance lay a technical story as compelling as any battlefield tale. The donut was no accident. As early as World War I, Salvation Army volunteers had fried donuts for American troops in France, earning the nickname Doughboys. By the time World War II erupted, the donut had become a symbol of home: sweet, simple, and portable. But delivering donuts across the vast Pacific demanded innovation. Field kitchens were equipped with portable fryers, powered by gasoline. Burners, capable of turning sacks of flour and tins of powdered eggs into fried rings of dough within minutes. Special donut wagons, essentially mobile bakeries mounted on trucks, were deployed by the Red Cross and Salvation Army to keep soldiers supplied. The smell of frying dough could drift across camps like a memory of civilian life. When American GIs handed donuts to Japanese civilians, they were sharing more than food. They were sharing the fruits of a vast logistical empire capable of transforming raw ingredients into comfort, even in the shadow of war. Coffee, too, tells its own story of engineering and supply. Every American soldier carried with him small brown packets marked instant coffee. These were produced by companies like Nestle and Washington Coffee Refining Company, which pioneered freeze-drying techniques during the war. The innovation was staggering. Instead of hauling bulky bags of beans, the U.S. Army supplied its men with concentrated granules that dissolved instantly in hot water. Each soldier's K-ration contained a packet of Nescafé, a small envelope of sugar, and powdered cream. To a Marine huddled in a foxhole on Okinawa, it was liquid morale in a tin cup. To a Japanese civilian, it was a miracle, an impossibility, born from factories that operated day and night thousands of miles away. Contrast this with Japan's strained supply lines. By 1944, Japan was starving, its merchant fleet shredded by American submarines. Civilians subsisted on millet, sweet potatoes, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns. Real sugar was a luxury almost no one could afford. Even the military struggled to provide its troops with sufficient rations, let alone luxuries. When American soldiers poured real coffee into dented cups and dropped real sugar into the brew, Civilians tasted not only nourishment but also the crushing difference between the two empires. The Americans fought with abundance. The Japanese fought with scarcity. The scale of production behind these comforts was staggering. The United States produced over 130 million pounds of instant coffee during the war. The Red Cross operated thousands of clubmobiles, vehicles staffed by women volunteers who served coffee and donuts to troops across Europe and the Pacific. One report from the Army Quartermaster Corps detailed how a single supply ship could carry enough flour and sugar to produce millions of donuts. Factories in Chicago, New York, and California worked around the clock, turning agricultural surplus into rations that traveled across oceans. In Detroit, automotive assembly lines that once built cars churned out mobile kitchens and stoves, while companies like General Foods retooled to mass-produce instant meals that to Japanese civilians. The implications were staggering. When an American GI handed a child a donut, that child held in his hand the weight of an industrial system Japan could not match. Every bite was proof of a nation that could feed both its armies and its enemies. Every sip of coffee revealed the technological gulf between an island empire on the brink of starvation and a continental power that treated abundance as routine. Even the packaging carried meaning. American rations came sealed in waxed cartons, each item neatly labeled and standardized. Cigarettes bore the brands of Home, Lucky Strike, Camel, and Chesterfield. Chocolate bars, stamped with the Hershey's name, melted in children's mouths. These were not just calories. They were emblems of modern mass production, of factories that could send familiar brands across oceans without losing their identity. Civilians who had spent years in isolation suddenly encountered products that spoke of another world, a world where food was plentiful, where industry seemed limitless, and where even the smallest comforts were engineered with precision. From a technical standpoint, these rations were marvels of wartime design. The Type C rations, for example, included biscuits fortified with vitamins, soluble coffee, and fruit bars designed for long shelf life. Engineers and laboratories perfected dehydration techniques, ensuring that milk, eggs, and vegetables could be reduced to powders and reconstituted in the field. Donuts could be fried with powdered eggs and dehydrated milk, yet taste almost like those from a stateside diner. Coffee crystals retained their flavor even after months at sea. Behind every donut shared with a Japanese civilian was a team of chemists, engineers, and logisticians who had made it possible. For the Japanese, this was not just generosity. It was evidence of an enemy whose resources defied imagination. Their own soldiers often went hungry. Civilians were told to boil weeds and tree bark to survive. When American troops handed out donuts, it wasn't merely sustenance. It was a psychological blow, a reminder that their empire could no longer protect or provide. The hidden advantage was technical as much as it was emotional, a demonstration that American industry could deliver both destruction and mercy with equal efficiency. The psychological impact deepened because the generosity came wrapped in technical marvels. To sip real coffee after years of substitutes was to taste a kind of modern magic. To chew a donut made from powdered eggs and flour carried across oceans was to confront a system so vast it seemed unstoppable. In the minds of civilians, these foods became more than rations. They became symbols of inevitability. The war was lost, and America's industrial abundance made that loss inescapable. Thus, the simple rituals of donuts and coffee were not as simple as they seemed. They were the tip of a vast iceberg of engineering and logistics, of factories humming across the American heartland, of convoys braving submarine-infested waters, of scientists perfecting freeze-drying and dehydration. Each item carried technical DNA that civilians could not see but could taste. And in that taste lay the proof of America's hidden advantage. It was not just the soldier offering kindness. It was an entire nation, its machines, its farms, and its laboratories, reaching out through a donut and a cup of coffee. In those fragile exchanges, the immense machinery of war was distilled into something profoundly human and profoundly disarming. The city of Stalingrad had already become a graveyard of armies by the autumn of 1942. For the Germans, who once marched with the unshakable confidence of conquerors, the dream of a swift victory on the Volga was collapsing into a nightmare of attrition, hunger, and endless bloodshed. But if the German Sixth Army was being ground into exhaustion, the Soviet defenders were not faring much better. For both sides, Stalingrad had transformed into an inescapable trap, a furnace that consumed everything fed into it. And now, in the late stages of the battle, the human struggle reached its most desperate chapter, inside the ruins of the city. The fighting had assumed a rhythm of brutality that no military manual had ever foreseen. Buildings were captured and recaptured dozens of times in a single week. German soldiers coined the term Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, to describe the chaos of close-quarters fighting in sewers, basements, and crumbling stairwells. The Soviets embraced this style of warfare, turning every structure into a fortress, every floor into a front line, and every pile of rubble into a potential ambush. Snipers haunted the ruins, turning the act of lifting one's head above a window frame into a gamble with death. For the civilians trapped in the ruins, the ordeal was even more unbearable. Tens of thousands remained hidden in basements or huddled in what remained of their homes, often without food, heat, or water. Many had been there since the first bombardments, and now they lived among the corpses of loved ones, waiting for death or liberation. Eyewitnesses described the stench of rot and smoke filling the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. In this landscape of horror, survival was not measured in days or weeks, but in hours. As winter closed in, the nature of the struggle changed. The Volga River, once a lifeline for Soviet reinforcements and supplies ferried across under fire, began to freeze. The icy winds cut through uniforms and left soldiers shivering uncontrollably in their foxholes. Frostbite became as much an enemy as bullets. German soldiers, under-equipped for the brutal Russian winter, found themselves huddled together for warmth, burning whatever scraps of wood they could find, even dismantling furniture and doors from ruined houses. Their boots split open from the cold, and many wrapped their feet in rags to stave off frostbite. For some, gangrene set in, and the battlefield surgeons had no choice but to amputate limbs. Still, the Sixth Army clung to its positions, convinced that reinforcements would soon relieve them. Hitler had declared Stalingrad must not be abandoned, and his generals echoed his determination. The city, he proclaimed, bore Stalin's name. Its fall would be a symbolic triumph for the Reich. But far from the front lines, in the Soviet high command, a counterplan was taking shape. While German divisions bled themselves dry in the ruins, the Red Army quietly built up massive reserves to strike where the Germans least expected. In November 1942, the hammer finally fell. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a colossal pincer movement aimed not at the exhausted German soldiers inside Stalingrad, but at the weaker Romanian and Italian units guarding the flanks. Within days, the pincers closed, trapping more than 250,000 Axis troops inside the city. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological shift was immediate. German soldiers, once certain of their invincibility, now realized they were encircled, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and even the hope of escape. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring promised Hitler that his aircraft could supply the Sixth Army by air. But the daily tonnage required to keep the army alive was far beyond the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Transport planes were shot down in droves, and those that made it through carried only a fraction of the food, ammunition, and medical supplies needed. On the ground, starvation set in. German soldiers boiled horse meat when available, and when it wasn't, they resorted to eating bread mixed with sawdust. Medical supplies ran out, leaving the wounded to suffer without morphine or bandages. Frostbite victims screamed as blackened fingers and toes were sawed off without anesthesia. Soviet loudspeakers blared across the front lines, urging Germans to surrender, while leaflets dropped from the sky promised mercy and food. For many, the temptation was unbearable, but the penalty for desertion or surrender was death at the hands of their own officers. In the city's ruins, the combat only intensified. Every block became a stronghold as the trapped Germans fought to hold ground, even as they weakened by the day. Soviet soldiers described entering buildings filled with the dead, frozen where they had fallen, rifles still clutched in stiff hands. In some areas, the Germans had resorted to sleeping alongside corpses simply to shield themselves from the wind. Meanwhile, Soviet morale soared. For the first time in the war, it was not the Germans advancing, but the Red Army dictating the tempo. Across the encirclement, the Soviets tightened their grip, methodically crushing pockets of resistance. Soviet commanders understood the symbolic value of Stalingrad just as much as Hitler did. They poured in men and material to ensure the city would become the grave of German ambition. As December bled into January, the end drew near. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, begged Hitler for permission to break out or surrender. Hitler refused, ordering him to hold the city at all costs. Reinforcements attempted a relief effort, Operation Winter Storm, but were halted by Soviet forces long before reaching the city. The ring tightened further. By January, the Sixth Army was reduced to a skeleton of its former strength. Soldiers were dying not just from bullets and shells, but also from starvation and the cold. The once proud army that had marched into Russia as conquerors was now a broken, starving mass. Eyewitnesses recalled scenes of unimaginable despair. Soldiers too weak to stand, dragging themselves through the snow. Comrades fighting over scraps of food. Officers trying to maintain discipline while knowing their men were doomed. And yet, the order remained. Fight to the last bullet. Stalingrad had become not just a battle but a theater of human suffering unmatched in modern warfare. By the final weeks, it was no longer a question of victory or defeat. It was a question of survival. For the Germans trapped inside the ruins, the encirclement marked the beginning of the end. For the Soviets, it was proof that the tide of war could indeed be turned. The tragedy of Stalingrad was reaching its climax. By January 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a city but a frozen carcass. The outlines of buildings stood like charred skeletons, the streets filled with snow drifts, wrecked vehicles, and the bodies of the dead. Amidst this wasteland, the German Sixth Army was disintegrating. What had begun as Hitler's triumphant push to seize the Volga had now descended into one of the most catastrophic military collapses in history. Yet, in those final weeks, the struggle did not ease. It only grew darker. Inside the shrinking pocket of German control, the situation became unbearable. Rations were nearly gone. Soldiers boiled wallpaper to extract glue for nourishment. They ate frozen horseflesh when they could find it, and when that was gone, they gnawed on belts and leather boots. Many subsisted on a single slice of bread per day. Starvation hollowed out their faces, their eyes sunken, their bodies gaunt and frail. Frostbite spread unchecked, fingers turning black, noses falling off, and ears lost to the cold. Discipline, once ironclad in the German army, began to erode. Reports surfaced of soldiers looting one another's rations, even stealing from the dead. Despite this misery, Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Stalingrad must not be surrendered. He promoted General Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, the anniversary of his rise to power. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to either fight to the last man or take his own life. But Paulus, weary and broken, made a different choice. The Red Army, encircling the city, had no intention of letting the Germans escape. Their artillery pounded the shrinking German pocket day and night, shells whistling over the ruins before crashing into the rubble. Soviet infantry pressed forward methodically, block by block, reducing German positions with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets. Every attempt to hold out resulted in devastating losses. Soviet loudspeakers blared across the front lines, promising food, shelter, and survival to those who surrendered. Thousands of German soldiers, too weak to resist, began to lay down their arms in the command bunkers. Paulus received reports of units ceasing to exist, companies dwindled to handfuls often, and divisions reduced to a few dozen survivors. Ammunition was gone. Wounded soldiers lay untreated, groaning in agony. In the makeshift hospitals, there were no bandages, no medicine, and no food. Surgeons cut without anesthesia, their knives echoing the screams of the wounded. Outside, corpses froze solid in the snow, stacked like firewood. On January 31st, Soviet forces closed in on Paulus's headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. Surrounded and hopeless, Paulus finally surrendered. When Soviet officers entered, they found the new field marshal sitting at a table, slumped and exhausted, unwilling to meet their eyes. His decision marked a historic moment. the first time a German field marshal had been taken alive. Yet even after Paulus's capitulation, fighting continued. Some German units refused to surrender, either out of loyalty to Hitler's orders or sheer desperation. These isolated pockets were crushed one by one. On February 2nd, the last remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered in the northern sector of the city. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The scale of the disaster stunned the world. Out of the 250,000 Axis troops trapped inside the encirclement, fewer than 90,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, only around 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. For Germany, Stalingrad was more than a defeat. It was a catastrophe that shattered the myth of invincibility. The Wehrmacht, once seen as an unstoppable force, had now suffered a defeat so absolute that even German propaganda could not conceal its impact. In Berlin, the news spread like wildfire. Hitler, enraged, retreated into denial and fury. Goebbels attempted to rally the nation with a campaign of total war, urging civilians to sacrifice everything for victory. But for millions of Germans, the seeds of doubt had been planted. If the Reich could lose at Stalingrad, it could lose anywhere. For the Soviets, the victory was monumental. Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and eventual triumph. The city had been destroyed, but it had not fallen. Soviet propaganda hailed it as the turning point of the war, a place where ordinary soldiers and civilians stood against the might of Hitler and prevailed. Across the Soviet Union, the name Stalingrad became synonymous with heroism. Stalin himself declared, "The enemy has been smashed." The myth of the invincibility of the German army has been destroyed. Internationally, Stalingrad shifted perceptions. Allied nations, watching from afar, saw that the Soviet Union was not only holding its ground but also capable of delivering decisive blows against the Nazi war machine. In London and Washington, the victory was celebrated, even as Western leaders knew the cost in human lives was almost beyond comprehension. The aftermath of Stalingrad was a landscape of ruin. The city itself was barely recognizable. Factories reduced to rubble, residential blocks flattened, and entire districts burned to ash. Survivors emerged from basements, blinking in the pale winter sun, to find their homes obliterated. Many discovered that their families had perished months earlier. The Volga ran red with blood and choked with debris. Estimates suggest nearly 2 million people, soldiers and civilians from both sides, were killed, wounded, or captured during the campaign. Among the German prisoners marched into captivity were boys barely older than teenagers and veterans who had fought from Poland to France to Russia. Emaciated, frostbitten, and broken, they trudged eastward, uncertain of their fate. For the Soviets, these prisoners were living proof of their victory. For the Germans, their long march into Siberia symbolized the Reich's first true humiliation. Yet Stalingrad's significance was not only in numbers or symbolism. It marked a strategic turning point. From that moment onward, the German army would never regain the initiative in the east. The Red Army, emboldened and strengthened, began a relentless push westward, eventually carrying the war all the way to Berlin. For the soldiers who survived, the memories never faded. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was an ordeal that scarred the soul. Veterans spoke of nightmares filled with burning buildings, of comrades starving beside them, and of the endless howl of the winter wind carrying the cries of the dying. For civilians, the scars were etched into their city and their hearts, memories of hunger, bombardment, and the constant shadow of death. As the world looked upon Stalingrad, one truth became undeniable: the war had entered a new phase. Hitler's ambitions of dominating Europe were shattered against the ruins of a city that refused to yield. The tide had turned, and though years of bloody struggle still lay ahead, the path to eventual Allied victory now stretched from the rubble of the Volga to the smoking ruins of Stalingrad. Amidst the corpses and the shattered buildings, history had pivoted. The fortress city, once marked for destruction, had become a monument to defiance, a testament that even in the darkest hour, resistance could prevail. February 1943. In the icy ruins of Stalingrad, the last shots faded into silence. The city, which had endured 6 months of relentless destruction, stood as a graveyard of armies. The German Sixth Army was gone, its banners captured, its generals in Soviet custody, and its soldiers dead or marching east into captivity. Across the globe, the name Stalingrad reverberated like a thunderclap. It was more than a victory. It was a shift in the very balance of the war. For Adolf Hitler, the defeat was an unhealable wound. His gamble to seize the city on the Volga had not only failed, it had destroyed one of his most powerful armies. Germany had lost nearly 250,000 men, not in retreat or maneuver, but in total annihilation. This loss sent shockwaves through German society. Mothers received news that their sons would never return. Towns saw entire cohorts of men vanish into the snow. For the first time, doubt crept into the hearts of civilians who had once believed the Reich's victories were unstoppable. In Berlin, the regime responded with a campaign of denial and desperation. Joseph Goebbels declared total war in a fiery speech, demanding that every man, woman, and child commit themselves to the struggle. Yet behind the propaganda, there was no disguising the truth. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility had been shattered at Stalingrad. German generals knew it, German soldiers knew it, and the world knew it. For the Soviet Union, the victory was nothing short of monumental. Stalingrad became the living symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and eventual triumph. It was proof that the Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, could not only hold against the German onslaught but also strike a blow so devastating it changed the course of the war. Across the Soviet Union, celebrations erupted in cities and villages, even as millions still grieved their dead. Stalin proclaimed that the German defeat had smashed the backbone of the fascist invader. The city that bore his name had been baptized in blood, but it had not fallen. Strategically, the consequences were immense. Until Stalingrad, Germany had advanced relentlessly, dictating the tempo of the war on the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the initiative shifted irreversibly to the Soviets. The Red Army, buoyed by victory and reinforced with new weapons and manpower, began pushing westward. In July 1943, they would meet the Germans again at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, and from there the tide rolled toward Berlin. Stalingrad marked the turning of the tide, the moment Hitler's dreams of conquest began to unravel. The psychological impact was just as profound. Among German soldiers, the memory of Stalingrad became a haunting shadow. They knew now that the Red Army was not a disorganized mass of peasants, but a disciplined, determined force capable of defeating them outright. For Soviet soldiers, the victory instilled unshakable confidence. They had survived the harshest conditions imaginable and emerged victorious. That belief fueled their relentless drive across the steppes and forests of Eastern Europe. Beyond the battlefield, Stalingrad resonated across the world. In London, Winston Churchill hailed it as the greatest battle in history, declaring that the hinge of fate has turned. In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt praised the Soviet people for their courage and sacrifice, recognizing that without their stand on the Volga, the war might have taken a very different course. Allied planners, who had long feared a Soviet collapse, now saw a partner capable of holding and defeating Germany in the East. Stalingrad strengthened the bonds of the Grand Alliance, setting the stage for cooperation that would culminate in D-Day and the final victory. The lessons of Stalingrad echoed far beyond the war itself. Militarily, it demonstrated the dangers of overextension, the limits of supply lines, and the consequences of underestimating an opponent. Hitler's obsession with symbolic objectives, his refusal to allow retreats, and his micromanagement of military operations all contributed to the disaster. For generations of commanders and strategists, Stalingrad became a case study in hubris and failure, but it was also a testament to endurance. The Soviet defense, every soldier, every factory worker, every civilian who carried water, dug trenches, or stood against tanks with rifles, showed the power of collective resistance. Modern military doctrine would draw heavily on these lessons: the value of logistics, the necessity of adaptability, and the decisive impact of morale. The human cost, however, was staggering. Nearly 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or captured during the battle. Families were torn apart, entire generations scarred. The ruins of Stalingrad became a silent memorial to suffering, sacrifice, and endurance. Survivors carried those memories for the rest of their lives. For some, it was the loss of comrades frozen in the snow. For others, it was the hunger, the bombs, and the endless nights of waiting in cellars while the world above burned. In the decades that followed, Stalingrad's legacy endured. The city was rebuilt, transformed into a living monument. Streets bore the names of heroes. Statues honored the fallen. The colossal memorial at Mamayev Kurgan, with its towering statue of Mother Russia, stood as a reminder of the battle's scale and sacrifice. Each year, veterans gathered, their numbers dwindling, to remember what they had endured and to honor those who did not return. Globally, the name Stalingrad became synonymous with resistance against overwhelming odds. It was invoked in speeches, in literature, and in films. Military academies dissected its strategies and mistakes. Politicians evoked it as a symbol of determination. Even far from the Volga, in lands untouched by the battle itself, the word carried weight, a reminder that in war, willpower can alter the fate of nations. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. Though the war raged on for more than 2 years, every battle that followed carried the shadow of that defeat. Hitler never regained the strategic initiative in the East. His armies, once the masters of blitzkrieg, were forced into retreat after retreat, bleeding men and material until nothing remained but ruins. For the Soviet Union, the victory was more than military. It was existential. The defense of Stalingrad had not only saved the nation from being cut in two, it had forged an unbreakable spirit. The Soviet people, who had borne unimaginable suffering, now believed with certainty that they could win. That belief carried them forward through Kursk, through Kiev, and through Warsaw, all the way to Berlin. And for the world, Stalingrad stood as a lesson written in fire and blood. It showed that even the strongest armies could be broken, that arrogance could be punished, and that ordinary men and women, when united in purpose, could alter the course of history. In the end, the story of Stalingrad is not just one of loss and victory. It is a story of endurance against annihilation, of defiance in the face of despair, and of the turning of history's tide. The city that Hitler sought to erase became instead his undoing. In its ruins, the fate of the Reich was sealed, and the path to Allied victory was forged. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was the crucible of the Second World War, and from its ashes rose the proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, the will to resist could burn brighter than fire, brighter than steel, and brighter than the ambitions of any tyrant.